front row here.
Governor, in the Finger Lakes region, the schools here were actually early adopters of test to stay. However, the new guidelines from the state almost pull some of that back. The guidelines from the state say they can only test to stay if the exposure was at school. You've been very clear, most of our county leaders have been very clear that there's not a high transmission in school, it's outside of school. So is that being looked at?
Yeah, it certainly is. Again, we are refining everything. Again, we react to what the CDC allows us to do, then we have to adapt to make sure even our whole quarantine idea, that it was, they said you could reduce an overall, and I'll get back to students, but the overall quarantine for individuals who tested positive. Everybody was sent home for 10 days. They may have been absolutely asymptomatic and are not contagious after 5 days, and yet they've got 5 more days. That has been such a huge disruption to our economy, from restaurants to the bus drivers to people working in schools, it's just been paralyzing. So based on what the CDC allowed us to do, we scaled that to saying, yes, you can go back after 5 days if you're show no symptoms, no fever in 72 hours, and you've also have been vaccinated. With respect to schools, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a thought that if they're next to a child who tests positive, instead of having the whole class go home because there could have been exposure, and having those children stay home for 10 days, which is wildly disruptive. I mean, I literally was with one of my staffers, and she looked down at her text, she says, oh my gosh, my children are going home for another 10 days. They just got back because they were exposed to someone else, back for a couple days, and now it's enough. We can't do that. That's almost as disruptive as saying it's full-time remote. That has to end. So we're going to be smart about it, and asking where the exposure came from is a different question, but I think we can get to the same place. We can really get to the same place where there's minimal disruption, test to return if you've been exposed but show negative, but then test again in 3 days. I mean, this is not just a one-off. You have to test again just to confirm that, and that's the way we can have more stability in our school system. But thanks for the question.
I have one quick follow-up on test to stay. The Rochester City School District doesn't have the resources and manpower to pull it off. The county has told us that they'll try to help, but they don't have resources either when it comes to manpower. Can the state do anything to help?
Yes, yeah, we just talked about how many new test kits we deployed to the mayor, and those are going to continue to be replenished. We now have access to 37 million test kits, which is incredible. It's almost as many as you ordered. No, we got on this early as well. We saw the storm brewing. We ordered a lot of test kits, but they come in doses of 3 million or so at a time, and so our highest priority with those test kits is school districts, and that's why we'll be making sure the city has what they need to stay open. And I commend the mayor's leadership for taking a strong position on this, and the county executive. This kind of leadership is why parents are going to be thanking them at some point, saying, thank you for allowing my child to have as normal as a childhood as they could during this time. We will get to a point where we get the vaccination rates much higher, then the masks can come off as we start seeing the cases decline. There's a trend here. We're going to get everybody back to normal in a classroom. But thank you. Question over here.
Yeah, is the state officially adopting the quarantine? Now it's 5 days instead of 10, and are you recommending that to each county? I don't believe each county is adopting that right now.
We adopted that statewide. Yes, we did. We did that last week. A couple of days, we were the first state to adopt. I'm trying to think, it was a week ago Friday. We were out there immediately saying that we're going to adopt that. We did put in the caveat that we wanted people vaccinated before they went back, and I know the CDC is looking at it. Dr. Fauci at least said over the weekend he's looking at whether or not they want to refine it to say that there has to be a negative test to go back. So those are just, again, I think the public understands this is an ever-evolving situation. We get a change from the CDC. We have to see how it fits into what we're doing, get the information out to people, and trying to minimize confusion about all this and getting the data out on our websites through guidance as soon as possible. But we already went to 5 days. If, again, as I said, vaccinated people can go back after 5, no fever for 72 hours, absolutely no symptoms. If they're still sniffling, you have to stay home. So it's actually self-reporting, but otherwise we are paralyzing our workforce. And we can say someone's essential, but if they have a positive test, and look at statistically, 20% of New Yorkers are testing positive, but many people don't know it. They're just getting a routine test because their employer requires it, or they just have a very light symptoms. And so we want to make sure that we get them isolated as long as necessary so they're not contagious, but get them back as soon as possible so we can continue on with the functionings of our economy and society. That's what's so important.
Governor, there's been some apprehension from some parents and some school districts within the state about going back in person. What's your message to parents and to districts, like including Syracuse, who have decided to start either remotely or partially remotely? Is there a message there from the state?
My view is that every child should be back in school unless they're testing positive. And the reason we know that this is safe is that it is not being spread in schools. It's more likely that they're getting it because of hanging out with their relatives and their friends and the neighborhood. The incidence of it being spread in schools certainly exists, but it's minor compared to their other exposures. So in that sense, they are safer in a school setting than being out there playing with everybody else. And the other part is the denial of a quality education. I mean, the teachers did the best they could. The parents did the best they could, but we asked too much to try and manage children learning remotely and the disparities among communities across the state. And we saw the digital divide became a canyon where communities of color particularly did not have access to high-speed broadband or the devices to allow students to learn, and they just did the best they could. We cannot have that. That was an injustice. We cannot have that anymore. The best place for equality of education, the best opportunities for learning is in a classroom. So I'm asking parents to petition their leaders and say, why is the rest of the state doing this? We have plenty of test kits. If we didn't have testing opportunities, we'd be having a different conversation. We're making them available with the whole thought that this will give parents and teachers the confidence to know that children sitting there are not positive for COVID, and let the learning continue. All right, thank you very much for coming out today. Really appreciate it, everybody. Thank you. Happy New Year. Happy New Year.